Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Today we have episode 257 up to bat, and I'm calling this, Is Cross-Addiction with Food Possible? I am here to say that not only is it possible, but cross-addiction can go both ways. Now, I can't go any further until I talk about the weather, everyone's favorite subject. The weather is now so lovely here in good old Salem, Massachusetts. Even the undead, the zombies, and the witches can't complain about the weather. Although that's hard to say. They never seem very happy. By the way, here in Salem, we all just heard that they are going to film the remake of Hocus Pocus, namely Hocus Pocus 2, this summer. Yippee, zippity-doo-dah. If you're getting that I'm really straining to be perky about this, you would be correct. The building where I live was the schoolhouse for the 1993 version of Hocus Pocus. So if they want to use this building again, Disney will have to get permission from us. So I will let you know what goes on when it goes on. Back in 1992, we were asked to take down our curtains so they could film the school from the outside. So when it got dark and they started filming the outside scenes, I remember peeking out my window while they were filming so we could watch. At one point, the phone rings, and I got a call saying something like, "The director would like you to keep your head out of the window." So that was fun while it lasted. Anyway, the scenes with the cat were also pretty funny because they would let the cat out for the first or second takes and then feed it to keep the cat close. But as you know, if you've ever tried to herd cats, and I'm guessing you haven't, this black cat would just run down the street and an overweight middle-aged man would chase after it. Having failed to chase after a cat running at full speed, they would pull another black cat out of a cage and try it again. If you think movies about witchcraft are silly, and I'm guessing you do, you may want to know about historic Salem, and I'm guessing maybe you don't. But I did put out a slideshow many years ago, and I'll give you a link to it in the show notes. Anyway, back to the podcast. I just heard that the FDA approved OxyContin for 11-year-olds. Yes, you heard that right. Which makes my head explode, because I just watched the documentary on HBO called The Crime of the Century. Anyone who still thinks Percocet or OxyContin is safe because their doctor prescribed it should watch this documentary. What that documentary left me feeling was this. For the sake of our children and our grandchildren, we need to take it upon ourselves to honor our own bodies. There is a place for narcotic painkillers in medicine, but that place isn't everywhere. I can define what these drugs are here, so there won't be any confusion about what you are taking. I myself was very confused when one doctor told me that Percocet was not OxyContin and implied that it is safer. It is not. Okay, so let's define these. Oxycodone and OxyContin contain the same active ingredient, the prescription narcotic oxycodone. The difference between these two drugs is how the drug is released into your body. OxyContin, with a T, releases oxycodone over a longer span of time, so there is no jolt to your system. They call it extended release. If someone chops this up and snorts or injects it, the extended release is gone, and the entire drug hits you all at once. With oxycodone, the release is immediate, so a larger dose is hitting your bloodstream all at once. Now, Percocet is oxycodone plus Tylenol. So Percocet is just as bad as oxycodone because it is oxycodone. Even a relatively smaller dose is still addictive, and certainly people have managed to take multiple pills per day. Percocet, oxycodone, and OxyContin are Class II narcotic substances because the government has determined that they have an acceptable medical use. Although when you watch this documentary, you will realize that the FDA guy who approved these drugs was being paid off by the pharmaceutical company that was making it. Literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in 20th century money. Now, morphine. Morphine is the refined version of the natural substance that is peeled off of the poppy bulb. It is American opium. This documentary reveals that Johnson & Johnson purchased huge tracts of land in Australia and paid farmers huge amounts of money to mass produce the poppies. And now they're turning the stems into an opiate product as well. Heroin is diacetylmorphine, or morphine. Heroin is available for mostly terminal cancer patients in Canada and Europe. But here it is considered unregulated. Heroin is therefore in the Schedule I basket, or illicit, illegal, and associated with lowlifes, according to the government. Fentanyl is the most powerful opiate, and it is supposed to be used only for pain patients who developed a tolerance for the others. And we all know how that turned out. Fentanyl is added to heroin and sold as a street drug. So fentanyl is accepted by the FDA, even though it has killed thousands, and called a Schedule II substance, which means regulated and apparently acceptable. Methadone is just another opioid that the government delivers and charges insurance companies for. Another Schedule II substance. Now, if all this sounds pretty arbitrary, especially legal versus illegal, you would be correct. Having said that, let's get to cross-addiction. Basically, what the experts are saying is that if you don't address the underlying trauma or stress that results in the addiction and go straight for abstinence, you may become addicted to something else. And with food, as I've mentioned, it can go both ways. There are two experts that get into this in more detail. Actually, there's a lot of experts, but I'm going to mention two. One is Dr. Neil Barnard, and the other is Dr. Pamela Peeke. I am putting two YouTube videos, one from each of them, in the show notes if you want to hear more about what they have to say. In Dr. Barnard's video, he mentions that at least 10% of women suffer from a food addiction. Then he goes on to say that the 10% might actually be a conservative number. Dr. Pamela Peeke has been interested in food addiction for over a decade. About 10 years ago, she wrote a book called The Hunger Fix, and that may sound familiar to you. I first heard of Pamela Peeke several years ago when I listened to a webinar given by Well Coaches, an organization that trains health and wellness coaches. The topic that day was the issue of cross-addiction from alcohol or drugs to food. But now we know that people who are morbidly obese and suffer from a food addiction, when they get a gastric bypass, can actually adopt another addiction. So when people mention cross-addiction, they mean exactly what you might think. People are in recovery from one addiction, say to alcohol, and they develop an addiction to fatty or sugary foods. We all have brains that can become addicted given a certain set of circumstances. The substance that is at the bottom of this is dopamine, or more specifically, how we respond to dopamine. There's been some surprising studies that have suggested that sugar might be as or more addictive than cocaine. They did rat studies not that long ago where they subjected rats to 3 different stimuli. 1, morphine, an opiate. 2, cocaine, a stimulant. 3, an Oreo cookie, which is I don't know what exactly. Not only did their brains light up in all 3 cases, But when they were given a choice of all three at the end, they chose the filling inside the Oreo. But then what happens if the rats, or us, become addicted to the Oreo? In a normal brain on a PET scan, now that would be a scan with people, not pets, you see red areas in the center that are lighting up because of the release of dopamine when shown pictures or videos that are pleasing to them. In a scan of a long-term cocaine addict, you see no areas of red with the same stimulus. So they're not getting a dopamine response to a pleasing video. You would take a lot more of a stimulus, say, seeing Donald Trump in a prison jumpsuit, to light up those dopamine centers. Now, the same is true of an obese individual. There are no red areas lighting up where there should be dopamine-stimulating brain activity. So what's up with that? Well, psychologists will tell you that when they're working with substance abuse clients, they suggest that the people stop using pills or alcohol first in order to get the best results from the psychotherapy. So I guess we lay people would say that being addicted to pills or alcohol might deaden the emotional or pleasure centers of our brain. As we all know, fatty or sugary foods can produce a sensation of pleasure, but that starts to wear thin as well. Sometimes people refer to these foods as comfort foods, but after a while the same foods stop being comforting. These foods can be used for a reward or for stress reduction, if we're feeling deprived, etc. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that eating fatty or sugary foods can soothe physical pain as well. As I said, Dr. Peak wrote a book almost 10 years ago called The Hunger Fix. A favorite line of hers is, quote, "Off the drugs, onto the cupcakes," end quote. But again, I'm here to tell you that cross-addiction can go in the other direction as well. After a morbidly obese woman many years ago told me that she was repeatedly raped as a child by her stepfather, I looked for evidence of the connection and found it. There was a journal article that said almost 80% of morbidly obese women were sexually abused. So now these obese people who undergo gastric bypass, or stomach stapling, as we used to call it, often develop another addiction. Sometimes it is to alcohol, or sex, or gambling, or shopping, or even drugs. The underlying trauma was not addressed or treated. And to make matters worse, in the long-term addict, the frontal cortex of the brain is also malfunctioning. The frontal cortex, among other things, is responsible for cognitive functioning and impulse control. All kinds of stress also impairs our frontal cortex. So the question becomes, does stress or trauma create a brain that is susceptible to addiction? Dr. Peak says in her lecture that any kind of childhood trauma or excessive stress or even neglect can leave us with inadequate or ineffective coping skills. Then when we encounter stress or trauma as adults, we use what Dr. Peak calls a negative fix. For example, we need a drink after a tough day. So the experts think that our prefrontal cortex is impaired. This is true with drugs and alcohol, but also food as well. The difference here, of course, is that we can treat an addiction to drugs or alcohol with abstinence, not so much with food. So we need to treat the stress or trauma to deal with the cravings. Now I'm going to give you a spoiler alert by telling you that there is a solution. And then I'm going to go back to the beginning and explain it all. This is going to take a second episode, so try to hang in there with me. It's a huge topic, but I'm very excited about the latest neuroscience that's been coming out about this whole addiction business. So here's the spoiler alert. The trick is not to avoid stress, as that's a pretty hard thing to do. The trick is try to exchange a positive fix in order to avoid the potentially harmful negative fix. And it probably won't surprise anyone who listens to this podcast that it's going to involve healthy eating and meditation, both at the same time, and also something called epigenetics. But I'm going to stop here and continue with part 2 next week. Until then, be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.